My name is Zoe Roberts. I'm 28 years old, and I was banned from Thanksgiving by my own parents to protect my sister's perfect image in front of her new boyfriend. You heard that right. My family thought my mere presence would be a problem, that I would somehow ruin the flawless picture they wanted to paint for this guy named Ryan Mitchell. When my mom called me 3 days before the holiday and told me not to come because it might make things awkward for Madison, I honestly thought she was joking. But the silence on the other end of the line, that heavy, uncomfortable pause, told me she was dead serious. Let me know in the comments where you're watching. The words she used cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse me of anything specific. My older sister had finally found someone special, and they didn't want anything to complicate the evening. I stood there in my kitchen, phone pressed against my ear, trying to process what I was hearing. My own mother was telling me that I was the complication, the thing that needed to be removed from the equation so everything could look Instagram perfect. It felt like being erased, like my entire existence was an inconvenience they could simply schedule around. But here's the thing: what her boyfriend confessed to me that night changed absolutely everything. Ryan saw through the facade, through the carefully constructed lie my family had been living for years. He pulled back the curtain on their twisted dynamics and made me realize I wasn't crazy, I wasn't ungrateful, and I definitely wasn't the problem. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. This is a story about emotional abuse disguised as family loyalty, and about the moment I finally stopped begging for a seat at a table that never wanted me. Growing up, I was always the daughter who existed in the background, useful when needed, but never celebrated, never seen. My parents didn't hate me, at least not in any obvious way, but they treated me like I was a supporting character in Madison's story. She was the star, prettier, more charming, more successful in their eyes. I was the one who made sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes, the one who picked up the pieces when things fell apart. And for the longest time, I convinced myself that was just how families work. Some people shine, and others hold the flashlight. This video is about what happens when you're raised to believe your value lies in your usefulness, not your. It's about the slow, quiet kind of abuse that doesn't leave bruises but leaves you questioning your sanity. My family perfected the art of making me feel guilty for wanting more, for expecting to be treated with the same respect they gave Madison. Every time I tried to speak up, I was labeled dramatic or selfish. Every time I asked why I was being left out, I was reminded of all the times they'd helped me, as if basic parental support was a debt I could never repay. I became the emotional punching bag, the scapegoat for anything that went wrong, and the unpaid therapist whenever someone needed to vent. If you've ever been the scapegoat in your family, the one who's blamed for everything but appreciated for nothing, stay with me until the end. I promise you, this story takes a turn that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about loyalty, revenge, and healing. Make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next is absolutely insane. And leave a like if you can already relate to feeling invisible in your own family. I want you to know you're not alone. And sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to them, it's what you finally do for yourself. I spent my entire childhood watching Madison get praised for breathing, while I got a head nod for straight A's. My parents hired a tutor and threw her an encouragement party once she got it up to a B. When I made honor roll for the 5th semester in a row, my dad said, "Good job," without looking up from his newspaper. It wasn't one big traumatic moment that broke MIT, was 1,000 tiny cuts. 1,000 moments where I realized my accomplishments didn't matter because I wasn't the child they wanted to celebrate. I learned early on that my role wasn't to shine. It was to make sure Madison's light never dimmed. Every family gathering was the same exhausting performance. My aunts and uncles would gather around Madison, asking about her latest boyfriend, her new job, her vacation plans. I'd stand off to the side, holding coats, refilling drinks, making sure the appetizers didn't run out. When someone did ask me a question, Madison would somehow manage to redirect the conversation back to herself within 30 seconds. And my parents, they'd beam with pride, never once noticing that I'd become invisible. The worst part wasn't being ignored, it was realizing my parents preferred it that way. I remember one particular moment that crystallized everything. I was 15, and I'd won a regional writing competitions, something I'd worked on for months. The same week, Madison got asked to prom by some guy she barely knew. Guess which event my parents threw a party for? Guess which one got posted all over Facebook with 100 celebratory emojis? I sat in my room that night, holding my award certificate, feeling like I was the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. And leave a like if you've ever felt invisible in your own home. That night, I made a promise to myself that I'd stop trying so hard to be shined, but deep down, I never stopped hoping they'd finally notice me. Fast forward to adulthood, and nothing had changed except the favors got bigger and the expectations got heavier. I became the person my parents called when the car broke down, when they couldn't figure out their insurance, when they needed someone to co-sign a loan because their credit was shot from bailing Madison out of her shopping addiction. My phone would ring at midnight with my dad's panicked voice asking if I could swing by to help with something urgent, and like a fool, I always said yes. Meanwhile, Madison lived 3 hours away in a trendy apartment my parents helped before, completely unbothered by the chaos she left in her. She was thriving, and I was surviving, one emergency at a time. The dynamic was so normalized that I didn't even see it as abuse until years later. My therapist was the one who pointed out that healthy families don't treat one child like an unpaid assistant while treating the other like a celebrity. But back then, I genuinely believed this was love, that being needed meant being valued. So I showed up, I fixed problems, I swallowed my resentment, and told myself that at least I was useful, at least I had a purpose. I convinced myself that one day, they'd realize how much I'd sacrificed for them. One day they'd see me the way they saw Madison, but they never did. Instead, they started taking me for granted in ways that would have been laughable if they weren't so painful. My mom would call asking me to drive 2 hours to help her set up for Madison's birthday party, then act offended when I asked if I could bring a +1. My dad borrowed money from me to fix his truck, then never paid me back because family doesn't keep score. And Madison, she'd text me once every few months asking for advice, then ghost me the second she didn't need anything. I was the app they opened in a crisis and closed the moment the problem was solved. Convenient, reliable, and utterly disposable. When my mom called me in early November to talk about Thanksgiving, I actually felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe after all the years of showing up, fixing things, and playing the dutiful daughter, I'd finally get to just be part of the family without being the. She started off normal enough, talking about the menu and asking if I had any dietary restrictions, as if she'd ever cared before. For a brief, stupid moment, I let myself imagine a Norman Rockwell kind of holiday, everyone around the table, laughing, passing dishes, treating me like I belonged. I should have known better. Then came the shift in her tone, that uncomfortable pause, the throat clearing, the way her voice dropped half an octave like she was about to deliver bad news. "Zoe, honey, we need to talk about Thanksgiving," she said, and my stomach immediately dropped. She explained that Madison was bringing Ryan, her new boyfriend, and they really wanted to make a good impression. She said it was important that everything went smoothly and that there be no complications. I asked her what she meant by complications, even though I already knew. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, stretching out until finally she just said it. "We think it would be better if you sat this one." I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just stood there in my kitchen, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to process what I'd just heard. My own mother was disinviting me from Thanksgiving because my existence might damage my sister's image. Not because I'd done anything wrong, not because we'd fought, but because I was somehow the wrong kind of daughter to have around when they needed to impress someone. She tried to soften it by saying we could do something just the two of us another time, but we both knew that was a lie. The message was crystal clear. Madison's happiness mattered, and mine didn't. I was the embarrassment they needed to hide. After I hung up the phone, I sat on my kitchen floor for what felt like hours. The hurt was so deep it felt physical, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed. But underneath the pain, there was something else starting to build, a quiet, simmering anger that I'd been suppressing my entire life. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to figure out how to fix this or make it better. I wasn't drafting apology texts for crimes I didn't commit. I was just done begging for scraps of affection from people who saw me as a problem to be managed. Done pretending that their cruelty was normal. Done accepting the role they'd forced me into since childhood. The hours that followed were strained. Part of me felt devastated, grieving the family I'd always wanted but never had. But another part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. It was like someone had finally said out loud what I'd always suspected, that I didn't belong, that I never would, and that maybe, just maybe, that wasn't my fault. I thought about all the Thanksgivings I'd spent in that house, setting the table while Madison lounged on the couch, cleaning up while everyone else watched football, smiling through the exhaustion while my contributions went unnoticed. And for what? For the privilege of being tolerated. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to beg them to reconsider. I wasn't going to show up anyway and make a scene. I was just going to let them have their perfect holiday without me. If this story resonates with you, hit subscribe and drop a like. The revenge that's coming isn't what you'd expect, but it's so much better. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call was the beginning of the end of their control over me. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up to aggressive pounding on my apartment door. It was barely 8 a.m., and I stumbled out of bed in my pajamas, completely disoriented. When I opened the door, my entire family was standing there. My mom, my dad, and Madison, all looking at me like I'd committed some unforgivable. My first thought was that something terrible had happened, that someone was hurt or sick. But the fury on their faces told a different story. Before I could even ask what was wrong, my mom pushed past me into my apartment, her voice sharp and accusing. "How could you do this to us? How could you embarrass your sister like this?" I genuinely had no idea what she was talking about. I'd spent Thanksgiving alone in my eating takeout Chinese food and watching movies, trying not to feel sorry for myself. I hadn't posted anything on social media, hadn't sent any angry texts, hadn't done anything except exist quietly in my absence. But apparently, that was the problem. Madison stood in my doorway, arms crossed, her face red with indignation. "Ryan kept asking about you all night," she hissed. "He wanted to know where you were, why you weren't there, and Mom and Dad had to make up some excuse about you being sick. You made us look like liars." The audacity of it hit me like a slap. They'd uninvited me to protect Madison's image, and now they were angry at me for making them look bad when someone noticed I was missing. My dad chimed in, his voice that particular kind of disappointed that used to make me crumble. "We do everything for you, Zoe, and this is how you repay us, by making us look like bad parents." I stood there, still half asleep, trying to process the mental gymnastics it took to blame me for a situation they'd created. They weren't here to apologize or explain. They were here to make sure I knew I was the problem, even in my absence. What my family didn't expect was that Ryan wasn't buying their excuses. While they stood in my living room hurling accusations, he appeared in the doorway behind them, looking uncomfortable and confused. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "but I don't understand. If Zoe was sick, why are you all here yelling at her instead of checking if she's okay?" The room went silent. My parents exchanged a look, that quick, panicked glance of people whose story is falling apart. Madison tried to laugh it off, saying something about family dynamics and how Ryan wouldn't understand, but he didn't move from the doorway. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Madison told me you don't really talk to the family much, that you're kind of difficult, but your parents just said they do everything for you. Which is it?" His tone wasn't accusatory, it was genuinely curious, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. I watched my mom's face flush, watched my dad's jaw tighten, watched Madison scramble for an explanation that would satisfy him without exposing the truth. But there was no good answer, because the truth was that they'd been telling him I was the problem child, while simultaneously expecting me to be their unpaid problem solver. Ryan's eyes moved around my small apartment, the neat bookshelves, the framed photos of friends, the evidence of a quiet, stable life. Then he looked at my family, still standing there in attack formation, and something shifted in his expression. He didn't say anything else, but I could see him processing, connecting dots, noticing the pattern. My mom tried to steer the conversation back to how hurt they all were, but Ryan had gone quiet, observing. For the first time in my life, someone from outside our toxic bubble was witnessing the dysfunction, and my family couldn't control the narrative. They couldn't make me the villain when a stranger was watching them treat me like garbage for literally doing nothing wrong. After my family finally left, still angry, still convinced they were the victims, Ryan hung back. I was exhausted, emotionally wrung out, and I didn't have the energy to explain decades of dysfunction to a stranger. But something in his face made me pause. He looked genuinely troubled, like what he'd just witnessed had shaken something loose in his understanding of the woman he was dating. So I nodded, and we sat down at my tiny kitchen table while he struggled to find the right words. "I need to tell you something," he finally said, "and I hope you don't think I'm overstepping. But Madison talks about you. She's told me you're jealous of her, that you've always been bitter and competitive, that your parents have to constantly mediate between you two." He paused, looking down at his hand. "But that's not what I just saw. What I just saw was 3 people ganging up on someone who literally did nothing wrong except not show up to a dinner she wasn't invited to." His voice was quiet but firm, and I felt something crack open inside me. The relief of being seen, of having someone acknowledge that I wasn't crazy, that the abuse was real. He told me that throughout Thanksgiving dinner, Madison had made subtle comments about painting herself as the long-suffering sister dealing with a difficult sibling. But when he'd asked why I wasn't there, the story kept changing. First I was sick, then I was traveling, then I'd chosen not to come. He'd thought it was strange but hadn't pushed. Now, seeing how they'd shown up at my door to blame me for their own loss, he was starting to understand that maybe Madison wasn't the person he thought she was. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button if you're as shocked as I was. Because what he said next made me realize this wasn't just about me anymore. The cracks in my family's perfect facade were starting to show, and Ryan was the first person who'd ever had the courage to point them out. After Ryan left, I sat in my apartment for hours, just thinking. His validation, the simple act of someone outside my family confirming that what I'd experienced was wrong, did something profound. It was like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through in the dark for 28 years. I'd spent so long being told I was the problem, so long doubting my own perception of reality, that having an outsider witness their behavior and be shocked by it felt revolutionary. It wasn't just about Ryan seeing through Madison's. It was about me finally giving myself permission to trust what I'd always known but been too afraid to admit. I thought about all the times I'd said yes when I wanted to say no. Every late-night emergency call I'd answered. Every loan I'd given that was never every time I'd rearranged my life to accommodate their chaos while they couldn't even accommodate me at a holiday dinner. I'd been running on autopilot, operating from a place of desperate hope that if I just did enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, they'd finally love me the way they loved Madison. But Ryan's confusion, his genuine bewilderment at how they'd treated me, made me realize something crucial. Their behavior wasn't normal, and no amount of bending myself into shapes would make them treat me with basic human decency. That night, I made a decision that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I was done. Done being the family ATM. Done being the emergency contact they only called in crisis. Done pretending that being useful was the same as being valued. I thought about that old saying about teaching people how to treat you, and I realized I'd been teaching my family that they could use me without consequence. The decision wasn't about revenge, not yet. Anyway, it was simpler and scarier. I was going to start saying no, even if it meant losing the only family I'd ever known, because the truth was, I'd already lost them. I'd just been too afraid to admit it. Less than a week after the confrontation at my apartment, my phone rang at 11 p.m. It was my dad, and I almost didn't answer. But old habits die hard, and that panicked voice in my head whispered, "What if it's a emergency?" So I picked up. He didn't even say hello, just launched into an explanation about how their furnace had broken, how the repair guy wanted $1,500 they didn't have, and how they needed me to cover it just until next month. I sat there in bed, phone pressed to my ear, listening to him spin the same story I'd heard 100 times before. The crisis, the desperation, the promise to pay me back that we both knew was a lie. What he didn't mention, of course, was the Thanksgiving disaster. He didn't apologize for showing up at my door to blame me for their own lies. He didn't acknowledge that they'd uninvited me from a family holiday to protect Madison's image. He just needed money, and I was the person he called when he needed money, regardless of how they'd treated me days earlier. The audacity of it was almost impressive, the way he could compartmentalize, could pretend nothing had happened, could ask me for $1,500 like I hadn't spent the last week crying and questioning my entire childhood. It was so perfectly on brand for our relationship that I almost laughed. But instead of laughing, instead of making excuses or asking for time to think about it, I said something I'd never said before. No, just that. One word, 2 letters, delivered calmly and without explanation. The silence on the other end was so complete I thought the call had dropped. Then my dad started stammering, asking if I'd heard him correctly, explaining again about the furnace, like maybe I hadn't understood the situation. And again, I said, "No, Dad, I'm not giving you money." The power in that moment was intoxicating and terrifying. I finally stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped being the solution to problems that weren't mine to solve. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Within hours, my phone was exploding with messages from my entire family. My mom called me selfish and ungrateful, reminding me of every single thing they'd ever done for me, as if basic parenting was a debt that could never be repaid. Madison sent a long text about how I was tearing the family apart and how disappointed she was in me, which was rich coming from the person who'd gotten me banned from Thanksgiving. Even extended family members I barely spoke to were reaching out, having heard some twisted version of events where I was the villain who'd abandoned my parents in their time of need. But here's the thing: while my phone was blowing up, Ryan was pulling away from Madison. I didn't know this at the time, but he later told me that watching them attack me for setting a boundary was the final straw. He'd started noticing other things too. The way Madison spoke about service workers, how she expected everyone to cater to her needs, the entitled attitude that had always been there but that he'd excused as confidence. The mask was slipping, and he was seeing what I'd known my whole life, that my sister was a narcissist who'd been enabled and celebrated by parents, who needed someone to worship. The real revenge, the kind I hadn't even planned, was that their own behavior destroyed Madison's relationship. I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't badmouth her, didn't expose secrets, didn't try to sabotage anything. I simply stopped playing my role in their dysfunctional family system, and the whole house of cards collapsed. Ryan broke up with Madison 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, telling her he couldn't be with someone who treated other people, especially family, with such casual. And who did Madison blame? Not herself, not our parents who'd modeled this behavior, but me. According to the hysterical voicemail she left, I'd stolen her boyfriend by playing the victim, which was almost funny considering I hadn't spoken to Ryan since that conversation in my kitchen. In the months following my decision to go no contact, something unexpected happened. I started actually living my life, instead of just surviving. Without the constant drain of my family's emergencies and demands, I had energy for things I'd neglected for years. I reconnected with friends I'd ghosted because I was always too busy fixing my parents' problems. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking salsa dancing classes on Thursday nights, and said yes to dinner invitations I would have previously declined because I was too tired. For the first time in my adult life, my calendar wasn't dominated by my family's chaos, was filled with things that actually brought me joy. I started hosting small gatherings at my apartment. Nothing fancy, just casual dinners with people who genuinely wanted to be there. The difference between these gatherings and family holidays was stark and beautiful. Nobody was performing, nobody was competing for attention, nobody was keeping score of who brought what or who helped clean up. My friend Jasmine brought wine and stayed to help wash dishes while we laughed about terrible dating stories. My coworker Marcus taught me how to make his grandmother's empanada, patiently walking me through each step, even when I messed up the folding. These weren't Instagram perfect moments, they were real, messy, authentic connections with people who saw me as a whole person, not a walking ATM or emotional support, and the shift was profound in ways I hadn't anticipated. I realized I'd been so busy trying to earn a place at my family's table that I'd never stopped to build my own. I'd been begging for crumbs from people who saw me as worthless while ignoring the feast of genuine relationships available to me. My apartment became a sanctuary, a place where laughter wasn't performed and love wasn't conditional. I'd traded the exhausting performance of a dysfunctional family dinner for impromptu pizza nights, where the only requirement was showing up as yourself. And for the first time since childhood, I felt like I actually belonged somewhere, because I was useful, but because I was valued. 6 months after I'd gone no contact, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that my family's life was falling apart in spectacular fashion. Without me as their safety net, they were drowning. My dad's truck had broken down again, but this time there was no Zoe to co-sign a loan or lend money for repairs. My mom had locked herself out of her email and couldn't figure out how to reset the password, something I'd done for her at least 20 times, and had missed important medical appointment confirmations as a result. Madison had gotten into credit card debt and needed someone to help her budget and make payment arrangements. But I wasn't there to manage her crisis while she complained about how hard her life was. The part that would have devastated me a year earlier but now just made me feel oddly detached was learning that they were telling people I'd abandoned them. According to their version of events, I'd cut them off out of nowhere for no reason, simply because I was bitter and jealous of Madison's success. They were painting themselves as victims of an ungrateful daughter who'd turned her back on the family that had sacrificed everything for her. Some people believed them family is family after all, and surely there must be two sides to every story. But the people who actually knew me, who'd watched me run myself ragged for years trying to earn their love, knew the truth. What they didn't expect was that their dysfunction would become visible without me there to manage it. Extended family members started noticing that my parents were always in crisis, always needing money, always making excuses. Madison's friends started distancing themselves after watching her spiral and lash out at everyone around her when Ryan left. The perfect family image they'd worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and there was no one left to hold it together. I wasn't gleeful about their struggles. I learned that revenge isn't really about watching someone else suffer. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the natural consequences of their behavior were finally catching up with them, and I wasn't there to cushion the fall. Looking back now, a year and a half after that Thanksgiving, that changed everything. I can see the experience with clarity I didn't have while I was living through it. Being banned from that dinner wasn't the beginning of my family's rejection, it was just the moment. They finally said out loud what their actions had been screaming my entire life. I wasn't wanted unless I was useful. I wasn't valued unless I was solving their problems. And most importantly, I learned that you can't earn love from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. They didn't treat me that way because I wasn't good enough. They treated me that way because they were broken, and no amount of bending myself into shapes would have fixed that. The revenge I got wasn't the revenge I thought. When I first heard Ryan had broken up with Madison, when I first learned my family was struggling without me, part of me expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, satisfied. But instead I felt something quieter and more profound: peace. The real victory wasn't that they were suffering, was that I'd finally stopped allowing them to make me suffer. I'd stopped performing the role of the dutiful daughter, stopped chasing approval from people who'd weaponized my need for belonging, stopped setting myself on fire to keep them warm. The revenge was in my liberation, not in their downfall. I learned that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own mistreatment. No dramatic confrontations, no public call-outs, no attempts to make them see what they'd done, just a quiet, firm boundary that said, "This ends here." I learned that chosen family is real, that people who meet you as an adult and love you anyway are sometimes more valuable, who've known you since birth but never really saw you. And most importantly, I learned that being alone is infinitely better than being with people who make you feel alone. The silence of no contact was so much more peaceful than the noise of constantly trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I had none. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. Being banned from Thanksgiving was the best thing that ever happened to me. I know that sounds insane, and believe me, I wouldn't have said that in the moment when I was sitting on my kitchen floor crying. But that phone call, that cruel rejection, was the catalyst I needed to finally see my family for what they really were. It gave me permission to stop trying, to stop hoping, to stop sacrificing myself for people who saw that sacrifice as nothing more than what I owed them. It freed me from a lifetime of chasing love from people who were never going to give it. If you're watching this and you're the scapegoat in your family, if you're the one who's always blamed but never celebrated, always needed but never valued, I want you to know something. It's not your fault, and you don't owe them your love. You don't have to keep showing up to tables where you're not wanted. Keep answering calls from people who only dial your number in emergencies. Keep hoping that this time will be different. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who refuse to love you back. And yes, it will hurt, God. It will hurt, but that pain is temporary. The pain of staying, of continuing to beg for scraps, that pain is forever. After hearing my story, I want to know, what would you have done in my place? Would you have kept trying to fix things? Or would you have walked away like I did? Do you think I was wrong to go no contact? Or do you think it was the only way to save myself? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I genuinely want to, especially if you've been through something similar. And if you found value in this story, if it helped you feel less alone or gave you permission to set boundaries you've been afraid to set, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next video, where I'll be sharing more stories about healing from family trauma and rebuilding your life on your own terms. Remember, you can't control how your family sees you, but you can absolutely control who gets a seat at your table.